You will not decide the fate of my people." Admiral Tiberian Voss's voice was iron, cutting through the grand chamber like a blade. His broad shoulders squared, his jaw clenched tight, but it was his eyes, cold, unreadable, that made the room pause. Around him, the Galactic Council's representatives shifted in their seats, their alien forms illuminated by the shifting blue luminescence embedded in the chamber walls. From the central dais, Supreme Chancellor Exiled Valtor regarded him, the alien's silvered skin rippling with fluid tension, his elongated pupils constricted to vertical slits, an unmistakable sign of displeasure. "We do not pass judgment on your people, Admiral," Valtor intoned, his voice deep yet weightless, as if untouched by gravity. "Your species has condemned itself. Humanity's history is an unbroken chain of warfare, territorial greed, and reckless technological advancement. You are an anomaly, a species that thrives on destruction. We will not risk contagion." The words settled like a lead weight. Earth's delegation stood in silence, their expressions locked behind masks of forced neutrality, but Voss could hear the subtle shift of boots against polished marble, the barely there hitch of breath from President Aldrich Verne beside him. "You mistake strength for disorder," Verne said at last, his voice quiet but scalpel sharp. "We have fought, yes, but we have built. We have warred, but we have also healed. The fire that burns in humanity is not destruction. It is survival." A murmur rippled through the council chamber. A species that communicated in clicks and warbles let out a sound akin to wet stone grinding against itself. Another, whose gelatinous form pulsed with shifting colors, flared from violet to deep crimson. Anger. A new voice spoke, dry and rasping. Admiral Irath Vostal, the Council's highest military commander, leaned forward. His forearms rested upon the edge of the dais, his pale chitin reflecting the chamber's light. "And yet, you stand here because of war. Not a century ago, your kind nearly annihilated itself. You are only united because necessity forced your hand. We have reviewed your history, and the conclusion is absolute. Without conflict, you stagnate, and stagnation leads to desperation." Voss's hands curled into fists. "We are not desperate," he said. "We are prepared." Vostal's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "Prepared? Yes. To kill, to conquer, to take what is not yours. That is why the decision is final." A silent shudder rippled through the human delegation. The ruling had been made before they ever arrived. This was theater, a slow, calculated performance dressed as diplomacy. Supreme Chancellor Valtor rose. His segmented robes shifted like liquid metal, reflecting the chamber's fractal lighting. "As of this moment, humanity is exiled from the stars." The chamber's light dimmed to a muted blue as the verdict settled, a death sentence disguised as mercy. "All interstellar gates leading to Sol will be dismantled. All existing off-world human settlements will be stripped of their warp capabilities. Any vessel found beyond your system's borders will be neutralized. You will live, Admiral, but you will never leave your home again." The chamber doors hissed open. A dozen council enforcers, clad in reactive armor, stepped forward, a silent command. Admiral Voss inhaled slowly, forcing his breath steady. He met the Chancellor's gaze, unblinking, and said, "You just made the greatest mistake in your empire's history." Then he turned and walked out. Earth. 6 months later. The artificial night of the sub-lunar base was a suffocating thing, draped over steel corridors lined with reinforced plating and oxygen scrubbers. Admiral Voss strode through the war room, the air sharp with the scent of burnished metal and polymer sealant, the undercurrent of antiseptic sterility clinging to every breath. Around the holo table, no, not a holographic screen, they had purged those in favor of something more efficient. The last remnants of Earth's true power gathered. President Vern, his face lined with exhaustion, watched as Dr. Everett Harlan tapped a sequence of commands into the projection interface. The room dimmed, and before them, a schematic etched in hard light filament unfolded like a living machine. Curving pathways, energy conduits, and a central core that did not function on standard FTL mechanics. Voss exhaled. "This is it, then?" Harlan nodded. "The Singularity Drive." A hushed silence settled over the room, heavier than any council decree. "We built something they don't understand," Harlan murmured, his hands tightening into fists. "The moment they cut us off, they assumed we'd rot. But they've forgotten. Humanity doesn't break. It adapts." Voss glanced at Verna. "How long before it's operational?" 3 months for a test run," Verna said. "A year before we can deploy." "Not fast enough." Voss turned back to the projection. The simulated fold paths within the drive flickered, erratic, constantly shifting like an algorithm without a pattern. That was the key. Unlike hyperlanes, which relied on predictable gravitational corridors, this technology operated in dimensional variants, folding reality at variable angles. To the Council's sensors, it would be as if humanity had ceased to exist entirely. A harsh laugh cut through the room. Commander Darius Kane, seated at the far end of the table, leaned back. "We're not just sneaking past them, are we?" "No," Voss said. His mouth curled into something close to a smile, but sharper, like a blade held in waiting. "We're going to hunt them, and when they realize what we've done, it will be too late." Kane's grin widened. "Well, in that case, I suppose it's time we took something of theirs." The room went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The silence of something coiled, waiting, a trigger held just at the edge of release. A sharp, alert chime echoed through the chamber, a coded transmission. Voss turned toward the display as a single line of text unfurled before them. "Blackout protocol engaged. Mission ready." The first strike had begun. The air inside the command chamber was thick with the weight of something unseen, something hungry. It clung to the walls, settled into the silence between breaths. The only sound came from the faint flickering of the hard light projection before them, casting restless shadows against the steel walls. Voss stood at the head of the table, his fingers pressing against the cold surface. The message still pulsed in sharp letters across the display. "Blackout protocol engaged. Mission ready." The first strike had been set in motion. Across from him, Darius Kane rolled his shoulders, his sharp gaze pinned on the war map. The lines of Council-controlled space pulsed in cold, unfeeling blue, cutting across the galaxy like scars carved into flesh. He tapped one long finger against a sector near Lagrange point Theta 5, a slow smirk unfurling across his face. "They'll never see it coming." "They don't even believe it's possible," Voss murmured. Harlan exhaled sharply. "They think of us as cornered animals. They assume exile crippled us. That's their first mistake." "No," Voss said, pushing away from the table. The metal beneath his palms burned with the residual heat of the projection. "Their first mistake was assuming we'd accept death." Silence answered him, heavy with the promise of something irreversible. A sharp chime cut through the room. Not an alert, but something colder. An incoming transmission, a ciphered burst of data. Kane's brow furrowed as he read through it, the smirk vanishing from his lips. "They found the wreckage." The words settled like iron filings in the air. Vern inhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Survivors?" "One," Kane confirmed. His voice carried none of the usual amusement. "Damaged ship limped back to Council space. They know." The shift in the room was immediate. The first stone had been thrown, and the ripples had begun. Voss exhaled through his nose, then turned his gaze back to the display. "What's their response?" Kane's fingers moved across the controls, pulling in a new transmission intercepted from a council relay station. The message scrawled in their encrypted language, but the translation burned in cold clarity below it. Deploying investigatory fleet. Standard formation. Minor threat level. The room suffocated in a moment of silence. "They still don't understand," Verna murmured, Voss's jaw set. "Then let's educate them." The void stretched before them, dark and endless, but the shadows held teeth. A council investigatory fleet drifted into position, its sleek warships illuminated in the distant glow of a red dwarf star. The flagship, Valtoran, led the formation, a vessel of brutal design, its dark metal hull streaked with the iridescent markings of high command authority. Inside the command bridge, Admiral Irath Vostal watched the readouts, his mandibles flexing in irritation. Something was wrong. The numbers were wrong. The scans showed nothing, not even debris. He turned to his second-in-command, Commander Zith Quor, whose skeletal frame gleamed under the dim console glow. "Repeat the scans." Zith Quor's elongated fingers skittered over the controls. His throat clicked as he spoke. "There's nothing here." Vostal narrowed his slitted pupils. "No anomalies?" "None." Yet the silence felt wrong. Too empty, too still. The kind of quiet that didn't exist in open space. His mandibles flexed. "Then where is the wreckage?" No answer. Then something flickered at the edge of their scanners. A whisper. A disturbance in the fabric of space. A displacement that shouldn't have been possible. It lasted for only a fraction of a second. Then, from the darkness, something moved. It came not from in front of them, but from above. A shadow that bent in ways warships weren't supposed to move. The first blast ripped through the closest escort frigate, its hull peeling apart as fire bloomed in silent devastation. Alarms screeched through the command bridge. The ship lurched as emergency maneuvers engaged, the inertial dampeners straining against the sudden shift. Vostal's pupils constricted. "Return fire! All vessels, engage!" But there was nothing to engage. The enemy was already gone. A second frigate detonated, its core bursting in a violent spiral of molten wreckage. Zith Quor hissed in alarm. "They're using some form of..." The third strike hit the Valtoran itself. The warship buckled, its shield struggling to compensate for an attack that should not have been possible. The bridge filled with the sharp tang of burnt circuitry, lights flickering under the strain. "Where are they?" Vostal barked. The tactical officer's voice shook. "They're..." The feed cut. The last thing Vostal saw before the emergency lockdown engaged was the war map shifting, the enemy's signal appearing for a brief moment, flickering, untethered from any known physics. Then it vanished, and one final message came through, transmitted from an unknown source. "You exiled us. Now we rise." Then the screen blinked to static. The war room aboard Solace Station was alive with movement. The first successful engagement had played out, and now the analysis had begun. Dr. Harlan stood with his arms crossed, eyes scanning the tactical replay. The projections replayed the attack from multiple angles. The Singularity Drive's unique displacement field appearing as brief distortions, unpredictable, impossible to track. "They never saw us," Kane said, grinning as he leaned back against the console. "Not even for a second." Voss didn't share the expression. His gaze remained locked on the final frames of the battle, the wreckage drifting aimlessly. "We need more than a first strike," he said. "This was a test. Now we escalate." Verna nodded slowly. "The Council will retaliate." "Yes," Voss said, voice steady. "And they will be walking into a war they don't know how to fight." Harlan's gaze sharpened. "Then we have work to do." Kane pushed off the console. "What's next?" Voss exhaled slowly, the weight of it pressed against his ribs, heavy with something greater than mere retaliation. This was no longer about survival. This was about something far more permanent. He turned, the flickering war map casting harsh shadows across his face. "Now," he murmured, "now we build an empire." The war map flickered, lines of conflict drawn and redrawn with every passing moment. Admiral Tiberian Voss stood at the center of it all, eyes moving like a blade cutting through the fog of war. A ghost of fire still lingered in his mind from the last battle, council ships tearing apart under an assault they never saw coming. They had expected a battered enemy, something weak and waiting to be erased. Instead, they found a force that had already learned to hunt in the dark. Across the chamber, President Aldrich Verne tapped 2 fingers against the projection interface. A section of council space flickered red. Lagrange Point Theta 5, where their first victory had unfolded. The damage had been done, but it was only an opening wound. The real war had not yet begun. "They'll respond soon," Verne said, his voice measured, carrying none of the fatigue that had settled in his features. "They have to. A species they exiled just shattered their patrol fleet. If they don't act, the council will look weak." Voss shifted his gaze to Darius Kane, who leaned against the far console, arms crossed, a knowing glint in his eyes. "They don't just need to respond," Kane said. "They need to overcompensate." Harlan, standing near the back of the room, exhaled through his nose, adjusting the display to highlight intercepted transmissions. "They've already mobilized. Their ships are moving in staggered formations. They know something is wrong with their sensors, but they don't know what." His fingers danced over the console. "They still think this is a rogue element. They haven't accepted that we've adapted." Voss's jaw tightened. "Then we hit them again." Kane grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Verna's brow furrowed. "Where?" Voss studied the war map. The council was expecting retaliation at the quarantine perimeter. They had reinforced it heavily. But the war wasn't there anymore. Humanity was no longer behind a fence. His gaze drifted. A new sector, deep within the council's trade routes. A place where resources flowed uninterrupted. His voice was quiet, but absolute. "Carthos Prime." Harlan's head snapped toward him. "That's not a military target." "No," Voss agreed. "It's more important." Silence settled, thick with understanding. The council's fleets were built on a foundation of supply chains, worlds dedicated to fueling their war machine. They had designed their empire under the assumption that no force existed to challenge it. But humanity had been forced to learn warfare in ways the council had never considered. Attrition, deception, subversion. They didn't need to fight the council's fleets, not yet. They just needed to starve them. Kane let out a low whistle, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "That's going to leave a mark." Verna exhaled. "Do it." Carthos Prime burned. Spectre-class warships flickered in and out of existence, their singularity drives distorting the fabric of space in unpredictable bursts. The sky fractured with silent detonations, energy pulses carving through freighter lines and supply depots in carefully orchestrated devastation. Below, the surface writhed in chaos. The ground shuddered beneath a chain reaction of fuel silo eruptions, sending thick plumes of smoke twisting into the atmosphere. The scent of burning synthetic materials clashed with the unmistakable sting of scorched metal. Civilians ran, their forms blurred by heat mirages rippling across the crumbling infrastructure. Carthos Prime had never seen war. It had never expected to. Voss stood on the bridge of the Icarus, watching through the enhanced display feed. The battle was not a battle at all. It was a dismantling of something the Council had never protected. They had assumed safety. That assumption was now ashes. A transmission cut through the secured channel. Captain Lucian Stride. "The last sector station has been neutralized. Cargo depots are offline. What are your orders?" Voss's voice was devoid of hesitation. "Withdraw. We've made our point." The fallout was immediate. The Council had expected a targeted strike against their war fleets, but instead, they had been wounded in a place they never thought to guard. Supply lines collapsed, schedules thrown into chaos, entire operations stalled. Supreme Chancellor Exiled Valtor stood before the High Council, his body tense with something rare: uncertainty. "They are not behaving like an isolated force," Valtor said, the words measured, almost reluctant. "They have warships that evade detection. They strike where we are vulnerable. This is not a remnant faction." A voice, deep and rigid, answered from the opposite side of the chamber. Councillor Mizath Vok. "This is an empire." The room stilled. The weight of the word did not go unnoticed. An empire, not a rebellion, not a rogue faction, not a scattered, desperate species clawing for survival. Something planned, something methodical, something that should not have existed. Valtor's jaw tightened. "We underestimated them." Vostal, standing near the center console, flexed his forearms, his mandibles clicking with unspoken frustration. "I warned you what they were capable of," he said, voice lower now, devoid of the arrogance that had been there before. "I told you, if they had a chance, they would find a way to use it." Valtor turned sharply toward him. "Then what do you suggest?" Vostal straightened. "We stop treating them as an inconvenience. We stop treating them as an insurgency." The council chamber felt colder. "We go to war." Voss stood at the viewport watching the distant glow of Carthos Prime fading behind them. There was no satisfaction in it. There was no victory to claim. This was not the end. This was the opening salvo. A presence shifted beside him. Verna. "They'll escalate." "Yes." "They'll strike back with force." "Good." Verna studied him. "You want them to." Voss's hands clasped behind his back. "We've dictated the first move. Now we dictate the next." Verna exhaled, his breath condensing in the cold of the observation deck. "And what happens when they come at us with everything?" Voss's gaze never left the darkness beyond. "We let them." A beat of silence. Then, "And?" Voss smiled, slow and sharp. "Then we break them." Far beyond them, deep in the void, council fleets were already assembling. They thought they were preparing for war. They didn't know they were walking into one already planned. The war had begun. Across the galactic corridors, battle fleets mobilized, their formations drawn into the cold calculus of retaliation. The Galactic Council no longer viewed humanity as a stray ember waiting to fade. They saw the fire spreading, and they could no longer ignore it. On the war table, projections of the Council's mobilization patterns flared like shifting wounds against the black. The response was immediate, calculated, but not yet desperate. They still believed their power was absolute. They had not yet learned fear. Admiral Tiberian Voss studied the latest intelligence reports, his gaze flicking from one sector to the next. A fleet was coming. Not just a strike force, not a mere show of power, a full military intervention. 3 battle groups, 4 dreadnoughts, escort flotillas numbering in the hundreds. More ships than humanity had ever faced in a single engagement. Standing beside him, President Aldrich Verne exhaled slowly. His fingers tapped against the steel of the command table, the rhythm steady. Calculating. "They think this will end us. They think this is still their war to control," Voss murmured. Across the room, Darius Kane leaned back against a terminal, arms folded. "Then let's remind them who set the rules." No one argued. The plan was already in motion. The Council fleet cut through the system with a surgeon's focus, their warships moving in methodical formations. The lead dreadnought, Sovereign Judicator, drifted at the heart of the battle group, its hull marked with centuries of service. It was not built for pursuit. It was built for conquest. Admiral Erath Vosatal stood at the forward command deck, his gaze locked onto the tactical display. His mandibles twitched, a gesture of satisfaction. Their scouts had found nothing, No planetary defenses, no human fleet waiting in ambush. It was as he suspected. The attack on Carthos Prime had been an act of desperation, a species flailing in its last moments, cornered, predictable, vulnerable. A transmission crackled through. Commander Zith Quor stood at the secondary control station, his skeletal frame poised with unnatural stillness. Sector scans show no fleet activity. No defensive installations detected. Vostal's secondary hands flexed. Then they ran. Their territory is scattered, Zith Quor added, eyes unreadable. They have nowhere to go. And yet something lingered beneath the words. A gap. A silence between the noise. Vostal felt it, the same way an old soldier senses an unseen predator watching from the tree line. He straightened. "Increase scan resolution! I want—" A tremor ran through the ship. Not an impact, not an explosion. Something deeper. Then the alarms erupted. From the darkness, the eclipse weapon activated. The void twisted, not with fire, not with impact, but with absence. The first ships felt it as a slow unraveling, their engines sputtering, navigation controls failing. Something unseen had closed its jaws around them. Inside Sovereign Judicator, the displays flickered with disrupted data streams. The tactical interface glitched, ship identifiers blinking in and out of existence. "Status report," Vostal barked. "The fleet—" Zith Quor's voice fractured through static. "Our warp lanes are collapsing. Energy fields destabilizing." A secondary transmission interrupted. Another officer, frantic. "We've lost control of the gravity wells. Star charts are—" Silence. Then, the first ship imploded. Not from weapon fire, not from external force, but from within. Metal twisted, decks fractured, whole sections collapsed inward as if reality itself had betrayed them. From the observation deck, Vostal watched as an entire dreadnought folded in on itself, the structure shrinking into nothingness before vanishing. He did not understand. He had no time to. Voss watched from the Icarus as the Council fleet fell into disarray. It was not destruction. It was a slow, calculated dismantling. "They never saw it coming," Kane said quietly. "They never thought to guard against something they didn't believe could exist," Voss replied. The Eclipse weapon did not fire energy beams, did not rely on projectiles. It broke the battlefield itself. It severed the natural pathways of space, cutting the Council's fleet into isolated, drifting corpses. The ones that tried to escape found themselves warping into dead space, their trajectory calculations corrupted. Harlan's voice came through the secured channel. "They're destabilizing." Voss nodded. "Then we hit them now." The fleet emerged from the darkness, Spectre-class warships tearing through the confusion like silent predators. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The Council's formations shattered. Their dreadnoughts, built for traditional warfare, were outmaneuvered, outmatched, unmade. The Sovereign Judicator itself, once a symbol of imperial dominance, broke apart under concentrated strikes, its hull split in silent agony. Vostal, on his failing command bridge, watched his empire crumble around him. A final transmission reached him. Human, male, the voice of the enemy he had underestimated. "You lost the moment you tried to contain us." The channel cut. Voss stood at the edge of the war table, watching the live feed. The battle was over. "Their reinforcements?" Verna asked. Kane checked the latest readings. "Scattered. They won't regroup fast enough." Harlan exhaled. "We just dismantled one of their largest battle groups without losing a single ship." For the first time since Exile, there was no weight pressing against them. The Council had always believed themselves untouchable. That belief was gone now. Voss turned away from the display. The battle was won. But this was not the end. This was the beginning of something far worse. "They won't let this stand," Verna said. They can't, Harlan added. Voss's expression was unreadable. We didn't give them a choice. Far beyond their sector, in the heart of the Council's dominion, something was shifting. The real war was still waiting. The war had broken them. Not humanity, the Council. Their fleets had been fractured beyond repair, their warlords stripped of their confidence, their empire reduced to scattered pieces drifting in the cold. The battle that was supposed to end the exiles had only proved their own mortality. And now, humanity was at their gates. Admiral Tiberian Voss stood at the center of the Icarus's war deck, his hands clasped behind him, his gaze locked onto the burning core of Prime Sanctum, the Council's throne world. The golden glow of the orbital defense grid pulsed with irregular flickers, evidence of a system too overworked, too stretched to maintain its power. It had been built on the foundation of untouchability, a throne carved from arrogance. Now it stood defenseless. Across the deck, President Aldrich Verne stared at the unfolding transmission from the Council's high command. The message had arrived almost immediately after the fall of their last remaining fleet. No posturing, no veiled threats, just a single request: a surrender. Darius Kane let out a slow breath, arms folded as he leaned against the console, watching the words flicker across the screen. Didn't take them long to fold. They never expected to bleed, Verne said quietly. Now they don't know how to stop it. The bridge was silent, except for the faint transmission loops cycling in the background. Distress signals, fragmented calls from ships too crippled to flee. Voices of an empire that had never prepared for defeat. Voss reached for the interface, fingers hovering over the transmission relay. The secure channel connected, and the image of Supreme Chancellor Exiled Valtor formed in the air before them. Once a figure of unshakable control, the Chancellor now sat in a chamber filled with static light fractures, a crack running through the metallic insignia embedded into his throne. His robes, once flowing with the weight of dominion, clung to his shoulders like the remnants of a ruined tapestry. His voice, when he spoke, lacked its former weight. This war cannot continue. Voss didn't blink. It never had to begin. A flicker of something, not quite regret, not quite shame, passed across Valtor's face. But it was crushed beneath something colder, something that had defined the Council for millennia. Humanity was a threat. You are a threat. Kane let out a quiet scoff. We were a possibility. You made us into a reality. Valtor exhaled, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. A ruler who had never known powerlessness was now drowning in it. What do you want? Verne glanced at Voss. The question was the final remnant of resistance, the last hope that humanity's demand would be something the Council could manage. A negotiation, a term they could twist. Voss did not give them that. You will dissolve the Council. A shudder passed through Valtor's form, but he did not interrupt. You will release every species under your dominion. Still, silence. Voss took a step closer. You will never attempt to dictate the fate of another civilization again. Valtor's eyes narrowed, the last embers of defiance surfacing. And if we refuse? Voss leaned in. Then we finish what we started. The transmission line wavered, static crackling at the edges, the final test. And then slowly, Valtor closed his eyes. His shoulders fell, and when he spoke again, it was not as the ruler of the Council. It was as a man who had already lost. We accept. The war ended with no fanfare, no final battle, no last stand, no desperate speech from the remnants of the empire that had once held the stars in its grip. Just a single declaration. The Council was no more. Humanity did not conquer. They did not take the throne for themselves. They removed it entirely. Ships that once bore the insignia of the Galactic Order were abandoned, their crews defecting, their command centers falling into silent ruin. Species that had been under the weight of the Council's rule stepped into the unknown for the first time, no longer bound by the mandates of a civilization that had long outgrown its own relevance. And humanity, the exiles, the species that had been cast into the dark, stood at the center of it all. On the bridge of the Icarus, Voss stared at the war map, no longer littered with markers of impending battles. The war was over, but something inside him still held its edge. Kane stepped beside him, gaze following his. "You don't look like someone who just won." Voss's fingers tapped against the steel of the console, eyes distant. "We didn't win." Kane tilted his head. "We're standing on their homeworld, and their empire is in ruins. What do you call that?" Voss exhaled. "Survival." Kane huffed, shaking his head. "And what do we do now? Rule the galaxy?" Verna approached from the side, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at the edge of his mouth. "We never wanted to rule." "Then what?" Kane asked. Voss's gaze drifted to the viewport, where ships once built for war now drifted as beacons of something else entirely. Not conquerors, not overlords. Something different, something the Council had never been. "The galaxy never needed rulers," he said. "It needed a breaking point." And they had been forged into one. As the last remnants of the Council's insignia were erased, and the final warships fell into the archive of history, one fact remained. Humanity had been exiled, and from that exile they had built something unbreakable, an empire of their own making.